Good day. Today, Monday, 13th November, the two great wars that are taking place in the world, the one in the Middle East and the one in Ukraine, continue unabated. I'm going to reverse the pattern of my recent programs since the 7th October and start this program today with discussion of the present state of the war in Ukraine. And I am going to do this in light of two articles which have just appeared. One which has appeared in a German publication, I believe it's a German publication, Brave New Europe, or at least the document I'm going to discuss has a German provenance. And just to say, it is an analysis of the negotiations that took place between Russia and Ukraine in February and March of last year, and which almost brought an early end to the war. There's also been an important article by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times, which I would like to discuss also, because that to some extent brings the whole situation also up to date. In addition, of course, I will be covering the latest military developments, which are also becoming increasingly interesting. In fact, I'm going to start with the military developments. Yesterday, from what I can understand, there were more Ukrainian attempts to try to counterattack and to slow down the remorseless Russian advance around Avdeyevka. From everything I can understand, every piece of information that I can see, the Russians have been able to continue that advance. They're methodically pushing through this village, this small place of Stepnoye, near to Avdeyevka, west of the railway track. They're edging towards the other village of Berdichi, which lies beyond it. I think most people agree that if Berdichi is captured, and if the Russians are able to consolidate control of Berdichi, then this is going to make the Ukrainian position, military position in Avdeyevka, not just critical, which arguably it already is, but desperate. Now, having said that, perhaps it's also clear to say that capturing Berdichi would not necessarily be the end of the battle. If the Russians push through and capture these two villages, they would need to consolidate control. There would remain a substantial gap to the south through which Ukraine could, in theory, continue to send troops and supplies to Avdeyevka. There is apparently some kind of concurrent Russian offensive to the south, from the southern pincer, also pushing north. Information about that advance is extremely sketchy, and there are numerous reports of Russian attacks taking place near the slag heap. The Russians have now established definite and secure control of the slag heap, and they're gradually been edging towards some kind of an assault on the factory complex, the coke plant and its ancillary buildings that lie adjacent to the slag heap. So there's fighting going on. It's all complex and difficult, and as I said, even if the Russians capture Berdichi, which is the ultimate objective, presumably, of this pincer movement to the far north, it will not be the end of the battle. Dima at the Military Summary Channel talks about how the capture of Berdichi and Russian advances further north towards the village or town of Keramik would put Ukrainian artillery out of reach so that it would no longer be able to intervene directly in the fighting in Avdeyevka, and I have no doubt at all that that is correct. But it's important to say that Russian troops, if they simply capture Berdichi, will be very extended. They will be exposed to Russian counterattacks in the area. It will require a lot of work for the Russians to consolidate their positions, and I still believe myself that we are looking at several weeks of fighting in the Avdeyevka area. Having said that, it seems to me that the trajectory of travel is now clear. The Russians are advancing, they're gradually closing the pincers around Avdeyevka. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government, has all but confirmed that capturing Avdeyevka is an actual objective. It is an actual Russian objective. He says that the Russians need to capture Avdeyevka in order to end once and for all the Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk city. So the trajectory of travel is clear. At some point within the next couple of weeks, the Russians, if things continue as they are, and there is no reason to doubt that they will, at some point the Russians will capture Avdeyevka and will have moved the front line forward and will be able to roll up, or so it seems to me, other Ukrainian defense positions to the south of Avdeyevka in places like Marinka and presumably Vuhledar as well, where the Russians have also been making moves, by the way, and where they've been gradually and systematically advancing, as they've been doing in Marinka as well, putting pressure on the Ukrainians, preventing the Ukrainians rotating troops from these hotspots in order to concentrate them in Avdeyevka. Anyway, the Russians have been increasing the pressure on these places, and if Avdeyevka falls, I think I saw it on Slavyangrad an account of the Ukrainian defense positions in this part of the battlefronts, the fact that Avdeyevka, Marinka, Vuhledar form a kind of defense ring. If Avdeyevka falls, the rest of that ring will still collapse, will presumably begin to unravel and collapse. Now, I say that there's also been reports, incidentally, that the Ukrainians are themselves starting to take steps to prepare for the all but inevitable capture of Avdeyevka, and there are reports that they're now hurriedly building defense lines further west to try to stem the Russian advance once Avdeyevka and these other places have been captured. I'm going to say straight away that if Avdeyevka is indeed captured and Vuhledar and Marinka are captured as well, then increasingly Ukrainian defences in this part of the battlefront are going to start, in my opinion, looking like they lack strategic depth, and with the Russians also apparently pushing now hard around Bakhmut, where fighting apparently continues from Klishevka, but where the Russians in particular seem to be pushing purposefully close to the village of Berhovka, towards Khromovo, and all those other villages near Bakhmut. Anyway, with Bakhmut also falling, then it's not, well, not already fallen, with all of these other places being recovered by the Russians, these places that the Ukrainians spend an enormous amount of time and effort seeking to recapture during the summer offensive. Well, with the Russians poised for further advances in the Bakhmut area, and also, it seems, in the Vremivka salient, with Avdeyevka captured, with these other places, Vuhledar and Marinka, possibly captured as well. It won't just be this area of the southern Donbass where Ukrainian defences start to lack strategic depth. Conceivably, it could be Ukrainian defences throughout Donbass that start to look like they might find themselves in that position also. And of course, with another Russian advance underway further north around Kupiansk. We don't know the whole details of that. There's been less information coming out from the Kupiansk front lines recently, though one gets the impression that the Russians are still pressing forward there. Anyway, the situation would in that case start to look increasingly critical for Ukraine, and we would perhaps see as a sequel at some point, presumably in 2024, 2025, a further Russian offensive conducted with overwhelming force to try to roll up the remaining Ukrainian defences in Donbass, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Pokrovsk, the last being the next big town west of Avdeyevka. And of course, beyond these three remaining cities, which would be difficult to defend, by the way, more difficult to defend. They're quite large places, but they're not, as though I understand it, surrounded to the same extent by this dense belt of villages and elaborate fortifications that the Ukrainians have been building over the last 9 years or so. With all of these places now under pressure, of course, if these three towns are captured, the way is open for the Russians to move west to the Dnieper. And I'm going to suggest that if that happens, the war for Ukraine will become existential, and it would then no longer be a case of Ukraine perhaps losing the war, but of Ukraine being in jeopardy, its very survival as a state being in jeopardy as well. And whilst I'm on this topic, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, who has obviously been given some kind of license to perhaps express the innermost thoughts within the Kremlin, has now come out with another Telegram post. He's done this in response to comments by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, that if Ukraine decides to give up the contested territories in the east, then perhaps it would be able to join NATO without them. He's floated that same idea in the past, and he's retracted it. And by the way, he's retracted it again, or so I understand. But anyway, in response to that comment, Medvedev has now published another Telegram post, another incendiary Telegram post, and he says in it, what he essentially says in it is that yes, Donbass is Russian, yes, Zaporozhye and Kherson are Russian as well, and Crimea, of course, is, and that's not even a topic for discussion. But he then goes on to say that Odessa and Nikolaev are also Russian, and they too should definitely not fall under NATO control. And he says that Kiev, Chernigov, Zhytomyr, all of these places are Russian also. And he says if NATO then wants the bits that are left, the area around Lvov, which he somewhat contemptuously names by its own old Habsburg name of Lemberg, well, if NATO wants these remaining scraps from the table in east-western Ukraine, well, basically they're welcome to them. But in effect, what Medvedev is doing is he's all but staking claims now for central Ukraine, the entire territory of Ukraine that was part of the Tsarist Empire, and, by the way, of the Soviet Union up to 1939. And he also is, in effect, saying that the Russians are going to make sure, eventually, that they gain control of that. And I have to say, this is not out of line with what Putin himself said when he spoke to those civil society people from Russia during the celebrations of the holiday, the Russian holiday, on 4th November. He brought up the topic over those discussions of what Ukraine consisted of when it joined Russia in the 17th century. He made it clear that the regions to the south, including Odessa, Nikolaev, all of those were historic Russian lands captured from the Ottomans by Catherine the Great, and with the cities like Nikolaev and Odessa founded by Catherine the Great in the 18th century. In other words, they have never been Ukrainian until they were assigned to Ukraine by the Soviets, when of course Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. But then he went on to say, Putin went on to say that in the 17th century, Ukraine only consisted of the territories of Kiev, Zhytomyr, and Chernigov, and he pointedly reminded everybody that the people of those territories, at least the notables who were running things in those territories in the 17th century, when they sought annexation by Russia, or union with Russia if you prefer, they addressed a letter to the Russian Tsar in which they spoke of themselves as Russian Orthodox people. So we can start to see that there is a convergence between what Putin says and what Medvedev says, even if Putin's language remains measured and to some extent elliptical, and Medvedev's language is now a lot more forthright. So we have that already. We have indications of what the Russians might eventually do. And we also have developments on the battlefronts which ultimately continue to point in that direction, the direction whereby the Russians would achieve their political goals. The one that Medvedev has spelled out, the ones that Medvedev has spelled out, and the ones that Putin has hinted at. Now, there is, of course, still the intrigue of what is happening in Kherson region and on the Dnieper, the Ukrainian attempts to establish bridgeheads there. So far as I can see, they've only managed to establish one small bridgehead in the village of Krinky, a couple of hundred men apparently there. There were reports this morning that the Russians have brought down massive fire on this bridgehead, that these TOS flamethrowers and their variants, which are becoming more numerous incidentally and more powerful with every month. Anyway, there's now a massive bombardment and missile strikes on this bridgehead. I've already made it clear, I don't think this is a particularly important theatre in the war. The number of forces involved is small, And I saw interest that Brian Belletti, in his latest video on the new Atlas, and of course he comes to this with a military eye, which I don't have. Anyway, he comes to the same view. So a very critical situation on the battlefronts indeed. And incidentally, there's more reason to think that the situation on the battlefronts is now causing increasing panic in Ukraine. Dima on the Military Summary channel, and I've seen this reported in other places, says that Ukraine is rushing a delegation to Washington, desperately seeking for the F-16 fighter jets that have been promised to Ukraine, for their delivery to be accelerated. And it's unavoidable, the unavoidable assumption behind this rather desperate plea is the news that we've been getting over the last couple of weeks, since the start of October, about Russia's methodical obliteration of Ukraine's air force. Dozens, scores of Ukraine's fighter jets shot down by long-range missiles directed to their targets by Russian AWACS aircraft, with those missiles themselves using apparently active radar terminal homing. And the result is that Ukraine now is desperately short of an air force. They're obviously becoming worried that if they, Ukrainian pilots must be becoming worried that as soon as they take off from Ukrainian airfields, they become targets for these long-range missiles. And apparently the idea now is no longer to use these F-16s. There's some uncertainty as to the exact number of F-16s that are going to be supplied to Ukraine, perhaps 60. But apparently the reasoning that has been given to the US is that Ukraine needs these F-16s no longer for offensive operations. In fact, Ukraine rapidly is moving from offensive operations to straight out defensive ones. There's, I believe, an article in the Wall Street Journal that all but confirms this, that they need these F-16s in order to provide some air defense to the troops, the remaining Ukrainian troops, who are going to try to hold the line against these Russian offensives that are now starting to take shape. So, overall, a desperate situation, a desperate military situation for Ukraine, one that continues to deteriorate by the day, and doing so on every battlefront, at least every battlefront that matters. How did we get here? Well, this is where this report from the German media that I was talking about, this report, is important, because it has been prepared by a high-powered team of former German diplomats and academics and military people. Now, the key writer is Mikhail von der Schulenburg. He's a former UN Assistant Secretary General, worked for over 34 years in the United Nations, and he also worked for a time at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He is also, by the way, a former German diplomat. Now, Schulenburg is a name in German diplomatic history to conjure with. The Schulenburgs are an ancient Prussian aristocratic family. They provided senior officers for the Prussian and German armies, and they provided diplomats of various kinds also. And a member of this family, though I understand not a close relation, Count Schulenburg, was Germany's ambassador to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, late 1930s and early 1940s. He played a role in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Like many Prussian aristocrats, he was something of a Russophile and was very keen to put relations between Russia, the Soviet Union and Germany on a permanently strong, peaceful footing. He was kept out of all of the discussions that were taking place in Berlin in the run-up to the German attack on the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. He was only informed about this attack on the Soviet Union at the very last moment, and when he had to explain himself and the German position to the Soviet foreign minister at the time, the formidable and on occasion terrifying Vyacheslav Molotov, he assured Molotov that he was not himself supportive of this decision. He clearly saw it as a mistake, and there are lots of accounts of this meeting, but it appears that he was deeply distressed. He eventually was allowed by the Soviets to return to Germany, where in the event he became involved in the anti-Hitler conspiracy, the one that resulted in the assassination attempt on the 20th of July 1944, following which Schulenburg was arrested by the Gestapo, summarily tried, and eventually executed. So, Schulenburg, the current Schulenburg, Michael von der Schulenburg, belongs to a very, very well-established, powerful diplomatic family, one which hews closely to this day to the Bismarck tradition of wanting good relations with Russia. And the others include Hajo Funke, who is a professor of emeritus for political sciences of the Otto Suhr Institute at the Free University in Berlin. I won't pretend that I'm at all familiar with this gentleman. But the third is Harald Kujat, General Kujat, once the highest ranking German officer of the Bundeswehr and a very senior officer at one time within the NATO bureaucracy. Anyway, what these three important people have done is that they have provided us with a timeline of the negotiations that took place between Ukraine and Russia between February and March last year. And they show how close to a deal the two sides came. And they also provide a detailed picture of the various intermediaries who were involved and who were playing a significant role in brokering the deal. One was the Prime Minister of Israel of that time, Naftali Bennett, who at Zelensky's instigation contacted Putin to see whether Putin would participate, would be interested in negotiations. Another was, of course, President Erdogan of Turkey, President Lukashenko of Belarus was a third, Roman Abramovich, the Russian oligarch who has long-standing Ukrainian connections, was a fourth, and, by the way, the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, as has recently been revealed, was a fifth. So lots of people were involved in these negotiations. And the negotiations reached essentially a positive outcome. Now, it's important to stress, and perhaps the summary of this document that I've seen, and I'm only reading an English language summary, this German document, doesn't make this entirely clear. But what was initialed in draft by the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators back in Istanbul at the very end of March was not actually a draft treaty. That still needed negotiation. Ukraine and Russia would still move forward to actually negotiate a treaty. It was expected that that would take several months, and at the conclusion there would be a signing ceremony which both Putin and Zelensky would attend. And some provisions of what Zelensky was already agreeing to in this draft agreement, which should be understood as an armistice, in other words, as a ceasefire, an agreement to end hostilities rather than to resolve the situation altogether. Some of what was in this armistice document, which is the document which was actually initialed, well, that would still have had to be put to a referendum in Ukraine, and it might not have been agreed, though more likely it would have been. But anyway, the overall provisions are the same ones as the ones that I discussed at the time. Ukraine would not join NATO and would commit itself to never joining NATO. Ukraine would also seek security guarantees from a number of countries. Importantly, one of those would be Russia. It would also agree that it would not host foreign troops or foreign bases on its territory. And an important point, a critically important point for the Russians, one which is not touched on so much in this German article, is that Ukraine also agreed that there would be no even temporary deployments of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory to conduct exercises, for example, or anything of that kind, without the agreement of the guarantor states. One of those would, of course, be Russia. And that, in effect, meant that the Russians had a veto over even minor temporary deployments of NATO troops in Ukraine. The other point about this agreement, and again, I don't think this German group have perhaps fully understood its complete meaning, is that the security guarantees would cover most of Ukraine, but Crimea would be excluded, and the two breakaway Donbass republics, breakaway at that time, because as of that time, Russia recognized their independence, but did not at that time seek to annex them to itself, to unite them to itself. The security guarantees would not extend to those two republics. Now, that was a fudge, because it meant that on the one hand, Ukraine could continue to assert nominal sovereignty over the territory of these two republics, and the Russians, in the meantime, could continue to assert the independence of those two republics, which is why the security guarantees were not to be extended to include their territory. There would have been an awful lot more that would have needed to be ironed out over the negotiations for the full treaty. What I've just described was the armistice agreement that was agreed in draft at the end of March. The subsequent negotiations that would have needed to take place before the final treaty was signed would have sought to clarify the long-term status of these two breakaway republics, which might have been difficult, and would also have sought to provide protections for the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, and that might have been difficult also. But anyway, that was the armistice agreement, and it's important, as I said, always to remember that it was not the end point. It was a crucial point, however, towards that end. It would have ended the fighting had it been allowed to take effect, and then the result, the eventual result, would have been complex negotiations, but in peaceful conditions, for a proper peace treaty, an actual peace treaty ratified by the parliaments of the two countries between Russia and Ukraine, which would have established the long-term relationship between these two countries, but which would importantly have safeguarded Russian security interests by keeping Ukraine out of NATO. And that was the direction with which events were going. Well, things turned out otherwise, and this is where Schulenberg, Kuyat, and Funke provide us with an understanding of what happened. Because the article tells us this: initial support for negotiations, and initially the West did appear to be supporting negotiations. Initial support quickly turned sour, with NATO opposing any such negotiations because Russia hadn't withdrawn all its troops from Ukrainian territories. This, in fact, killed all negotiations. Schulenberg, former UN Assistant Secretary General in peace missions, writes that NATO had already decided at a special summit on March 24th, 2022, not to support these peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. That puts the date upon which NATO decided that it would oppose these negotiations earlier than most people thought, and before the initialing by the two sides of the armistice agreement in the meeting in Istanbul. And this was all agreed at a special summit by NATO on March 24th, and Biden himself flew in especially to this summit, and it's clear that he went there with the specific intention of making it clear that the United States was unhappy about the negotiations that were taking place between Russia and Ukraine, and that he expected NATO to combine, to unite around a policy of opposing these negotiations. Well, Zelensky initially, it seems, didn't get the message. 3 days later, on the 27th of March, 2022, he spoke to Russian journalists, about, I think, the last occasion, by the way, when Zelensky has actually had a meeting with Russian journalists, and he basically said that he was sticking with the negotiation process then. On 28th March, Putin, and that does appear to be linked with this interview that Zelensky gave on the previous day to the Russian journalists. On the following day, 28th March, Putin agreed to pull the Russian troops from the Kharkiv and Kiev areas, from Chernigov, Sumy, and from around Kiev. And it's clear that there were discussions underway between the Ukrainians and the Russians at that time, and that the Ukrainians were reassuring the Russians that despite what had happened 3 days before at this NATO summit where Biden had attended, that they would go ahead with the armistice agreement and the peace agreement that was almost on the verge of being concluded. On the 29th of March, the Istanbul meeting, chaired by Erdogan, took place. The negotiators from Ukraine and Russia initialed the armistice agreement, and then on that very same day, even as that agreement was being initialed, Biden had a telephone conference with Scholz, Draghi, Macron, and the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, in which again he made clear his own opposition to the direction of events, the diplomatic events that were taking place in Istanbul, and a statement was then published by these 5 Western leaders following those discussions, which then formulated what were in effect preconditions for future negotiations, which Ukraine was expected to follow in terms of any negotiations with Russia. And the preconditions were contained in this statement. The leaders agreed to continue to provide strong support to Ukraine. They again urged Russian President Putin to agree to a ceasefire, to cease all hostilities, to withdraw Russian soldiers from Ukraine, and to allow for a diplomatic solution. So in effect, they were saying that the negotiations could only happen, that the West would only support negotiations between Russia and Ukraine once the Russians had withdrawn all their troops from Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, left undefined, simply referencing Ukraine in that way in an announcement on the 29th of March, suggests also a pullback by Russian troops from Crimea as well. Now that, of course, was completely unacceptable. The Ukrainians knew that it was unacceptable, and thereafter the talks, the whole process of the negotiations rapidly unravelled. And this German report then goes on to reference an article in the Washington Post dated 5th April, which says that for some in NATO it's better for Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too soon or at too high a price for Kiev and the rest of Europe. Well, surely the question of a price for peace by Kiev logically ought to be something for Kiev to decide, but we can see that that was not the Western view. Price for Europe, and indeed for the West, was what ultimately mattered. And the Washington Post article then went on to say that the West, these people who were opposed to these peace moves, felt that Zelensky should keep fighting until Russia is completely defeated. And then, of course, we have telephone calls. Again, this report, at least the summary of this report, doesn't mention that, but a telephone call from Prime Minister Johnson in London, calling Zelensky and telling him that the British were opposed these negotiations. And then on April 9th, Johnson arrived unannounced in Kiev and told Zelensky that the West was not ready to end the war. And according to Britain's Guardian, on April 28th, Johnson instructed, and instructed is a quote from that Guardian article, Zelensky not to make any concessions to Putin. And the German report then provides a long quote from articles which appeared in Ukrainska Pravda. No sooner had the Ukrainian negotiators and Abramovich-Medinsky, Abramovich is this Russian oligarch, obviously, who was partly mediating the discussions. Medinsky was the lead Russian negotiator, agreed in broad terms on the structure of a possible future agreement after the Istanbul results. Then British Prime Minister Johnson appeared in Kiev almost without warning. He brought two simple messages with him. The first was that Putin is a war criminal. He should be pressured, not negotiated with. The second is that even if Ukraine is willing to sign some agreements with Putin on guarantees, the collective West is not. So, the Western powers would not join Russia in extending security guarantees to Ukraine if this deal between Ukraine and Russia went ahead. And of course, Zelensky would have known that that would have made the whole deal unsellable to the hardliners in Kiev and probably to much of the Ukrainian population at that time. And when, of course, Johnson came and said that, that in effect meant that the entire peace process could not go ahead. And then we're told, this is all from Ukrainska Pravda, you can sign an agreement, we can sign an agreement with you, that is to say, Johnson said, we can sign an agreement with you, Ukraine, but not with Putin. He will screw everyone over anyway. And that was what Johnson apparently said. And the Ukrainska Pravda then says that one of Zelensky's close associates said that there was much more behind this visit and Johnson's words than just reluctance to engage in agreements with Russia. Johnson took the position that the collective West, which as recently as February had suggested that Zelensky should surrender and flee, now felt that Putin was not really as powerful as they had previously imagined. Moreover, there was an opportunity to put pressure on Putin, and the West wanted to take it. And then more reports about how British MPs like Alicia Kearns were saying we'd rather arm the Ukrainians to the teeth than give Putin a success. And Liz Truss, who was of course at that time Britain's foreign minister, was saying it is a strategic imperative for us all, and that military support to Ukraine must be massively expanded, and victory for Ukraine is a strategic imperative. And Johnson and Truss, an article in The Guardian at that time, said that they wanted to keep Ukraine fighting until Russia is completely defeated. They need a triumph in their proxy war, and that in the meantime, anyone who disagrees with them can be dismissed as a weakling, a coward, or a Putin supporter, that this conflict is being exploited by Britain basically for that kind of purpose. And then the summary of all of these discussions wraps up by pointing out that on 25th April, just a short time after all of these things, Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, said that the US was looking to use the war as an opportunity to permanently weaken Russia militarily and economically. And on April 26th, 2022, a meeting of NATO defence ministers in Ramstein, with Austin, of course, present, agreed that military victory for Ukraine was, from this point on, a strategic goal. Now, I've said this all out in detail, but I think a number of points can be made from this, which, if they're not exactly new, they are things that we should hold on to. Firstly, the Western powers did not want these negotiations to succeed. In my opinion, their earlier statements appearing to welcome negotiations, which they'd made in February and early March, were based on the presumption that the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine would fail. I should say at the time, I too thought that the negotiations would fail. The Western powers became alarmed when, instead of failing, the negotiations looked like they were succeeding. And it was that which caused the Western powers suddenly to shift and to prevent the negotiations from going forward. And it is not difficult to understand why. Because, of course, the war then, as since, was not ultimately about Ukraine at all. It was about NATO expansion. It was about breaking Russia. It was about achieving regime change in Moscow. And in fact, somewhere in this piece, there is in fact a straightforward recognition that the Western objective at that time was to break Russia. And they thought they could do that. They thought this would happen partly by military means. They were perhaps overconfident because the Russians had not occupied Kiev in March 2022, as perhaps they'd expected. But of course, the Russians, as we see, were always pursuing a negotiating process at that point. But they perhaps also were overconfident because in February and March, they were still expecting this avalanche of sanctions that they had launched against Russia to succeed, to trigger an economic crisis in Moscow, shortages in the shops, food and riots, protests by the oligarchs, and eventual regime change in Moscow. And they didn't give up on that idea. This is despite the fact that the negotiations were followed by a Russian offensive in the Donbass, which resulted in Russia's capture of Mariupol and of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. We now know that they were busy putting together more forces to try to launch those offensives, those Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region. And the offensives duly took place, and they turned out to be much more protracted and far more difficult than expected. Ukrainian losses were far higher, and the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye, breaking the land bridge, which was expected to follow sequentially, had to be postponed. But even then, they weren't prepared to give up on this greater project of trying to weaken Russia. And probably what encouraged them to do this, and this is where I come to Stephen Bryan's article, is that they may have been misled by the open dissension between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, and the Russian Defense Ministry. And Stephen Bryan in Asia Times says, and he seems to say this with authority, though he doesn't disclose his sources, but he does mention his friend Larry Johnson, whom I've referenced many times and who has this invaluable blog, Sonar 21, and of course Larry Johnson does have contacts in the US government, and perhaps Stephen Bryan has others. In fact, I'm sure he does. Anyway, Stephen Bryan then goes on to say that appears to confirm that Prigozhin was indeed in contact at that time with Ukrainian intelligence, that he'd had meetings with Ukrainian intelligence officers in Africa, that there was some kind of communication underway between Prigozhin and the Ukrainian intelligence chief Kirill Budanov, and that the attempted coup that Prigozhin launched in June of this year, shortly after Ukraine launched its offensive, was in effect a part of the preparations, part of the plan for that offensive. Now, I speculated about that at the time. I thought that that might indeed be the case, and Stephen Bryan appears to confirm that it was. And again, that brings to mind that piece by Foreign Policy before the Ukrainian offensive was launched, about how Ukraine needed to break through immediately, whilst the Russian political leadership was panicked and paralyzed, and that if Ukraine was able to break through in that way, then the Ukrainian offensive would succeed. And of course, all this talk about paralysis and panic on the part of the political leadership in Moscow makes better sense if, of course, some kind of coup was in preparation, and if, perhaps through Kirill Budanov and Ukrainian intelligence, the Americans and presumably the British had got wind of it, were aware of it. And of course that makes a lot more sense of the Ukrainian offensive. It's been admitted in articles in the US media that when the Western powers were urging Ukraine to launch its offensive this summer, they were aware already that Ukraine lacked the necessary military equipment and the force to break through, but nonetheless they still demanded that Ukraine launch this offensive. Despite that, and of course, if they thought that the offensive would take place in conjunction with a political crisis in Moscow, leading perhaps to regime change in Moscow, well, leading definitely to regime change in Moscow, then of course that might have been why, despite the obstacles, they encouraged Ukraine to conduct its offensive in the first place. Now, I'm going to say straight away, this is a difficult thing to do, would have been a difficult thing to pull off at any time. The America of the 1950s might have been able to do it. Today's America, in my opinion, lacks the knowledge of Russia and the skills. So this was an overcomplicated attempt to launch at regime change that took place in Moscow, that took place last summer. And in fact, the Prigozhin mutiny collapsed almost as soon as it was launched, and the Ukrainian offensive predictably petered out and was run down. And is now run down. Now, it seems to me that the correct thing to do for the Western powers and for Ukraine was to reassess the situation in the summer of 2022. It ought to have become increasingly clear at that point that the sanctions were not going to deliver the knockout blow that the West perhaps expected, that Putin was not going to fall, the Russian economy was not going to collapse, Russia was not going to become diplomatically and economically isolated in the way that the Western leaders expected. And then it ought to have become clear also after Ukraine's offensives of the autumn of 2022 that Russian resistance was extremely strong, that Ukrainian losses over the course of those offensives were extremely high, that the prospects of Ukraine achieving a military victory over Russia were slim to non-existent. And it also ought to have been the case that people in the West should have realized that staking any future course of events on someone like Prigozhin, hoping that Prigozhin would be the magic bullet that would change everything, putting all one's chips, if you like, on this volatile and unstable character was unwise. And one does get the sense that there were people in Washington at that time who were already starting to express concern. I remember that at the start of this year, I was pointing out that General Milley at that time was suggesting that perhaps the right thing to do was that for Ukraine to seek a pause, to initiate negotiations with the Russians, that it had perhaps achieved all that realistically it could do. And it also seemed to me that there was pressure from other sources, other voices within the US establishment. There was an important piece from report from the Rand Corporation, partly drafted by Mr. Chara, suggesting that a prolonged war in Ukraine was not in US interests and was unwinnable, and other reports at that time from within the US military-industrial complex casting doubt upon whether the United States and the West would be able to keep Ukraine equipped indefinitely for a long war. Anyway, all of those reports, all those warnings were there. And perhaps the right thing to have done would have been to follow the advice provided by people like George Beebe and Jim Webb, who wrote an important piece about this in Time magazine in August, suggesting that after the costly offensives of the autumn of 2022, Ukraine and the West should seek a negotiation with Ukraine going on the defensive. Of course, they didn't. They went for broke. They launched their offensive. They placed their reliance on Prigozhin, and it all failed. And now, so it seems to me, they're left without a plan. There's been talk of a freeze of the war. My impression is that that idea has, to all intents and purposes, melted away. I don't think anybody now really believes that the Russians would agree to a freeze. And of course, Zelensky himself is categorically rejecting it. And the trajectory of the war is the one that I outlined at the start of this program. One which inexorably is moving towards a final Ukrainian defeat. It's not surprising that Zelensky himself, who does appear to have been seriously interested in negotiations back in March, now feels deeply betrayed by his Western allies. I wonder what other pressure might have been placed on him back in March and April, which caused him to pull out of the negotiations. I remember one picture of him in which he appeared touring that northern suburb of Kiev, which attracted a lot of attention in April of last year, but about which one hears very little now. And I remember seeing him surrounded by people who were presented as his bodyguards. And they looked extremely tough looking men, and Zelensky himself, in my opinion, looked extremely nervous and frightened. Well, I'm not suggesting that he was at that time directly threatened, but it does seem to me as if he felt insecure, and certainly he was probably worried that without the support of the West, he would not have been able to survive. Anyway, there we are. An opportunity to end the war thrown away because of a pursuit of the mirage of regime change in Moscow. And the result is that it is not regime change in Moscow any longer, which is the primary topic of discussion now, but rather potentially regime change in Kiev, with the Russians gnawing away at Ukraine's front lines, Ukraine running out of men, aircraft and machines, and the West unable to replace them. Now, I'm going to finish this article by saying that there's been more reports, Dima again at the Military Summary channel spoke about this, of more and more Ukrainian soldiers simply refusing to obey orders to advance on Russian positions. And I'm confident that this is indeed something that is actually happening. And I've spoken before about how the Ukrainian soldiers defending Avdeyevka have published a video complaining about the fact that their officers, their senior officers, have abandoned them in Avdeyevka. And I noticed that the Russian Ministry of Defense is now exploiting this growing doubt about Ukrainians, from Ukrainian soldiers, about the loyalty to them of their own officers. They've just published an interview with a Ukrainian soldier who was captured on the Dnieper front lines, and he also, this is a Russian, of course, produced interview, so you can believe it or not as you will. But anyway, he says, this soldier says, that all of the Ukrainian troops on the east bank of the Dnieper, the ones in Kriki, the ones who are now being attacked by these flamethrower tanks and all of that, that they too are there without their officers to lead them, that they are doing this all by themselves and to a great extent feel abandoned by their own officers. I don't myself think that we are yet in a situation where the Ukrainian military is going to break down, where we're going to start to see Ukrainian soldiers start to quit, or where Ukrainian generals might start doing the kind of thing that General Lee did at Appomattox, capitulating to the Russians without first getting consent from the political authorities. I don't think we are at that point yet, but it seems to me that these are more than stray pebbles that we're seeing. These first confirmed cases of Ukrainian soldiers refusing to obey orders. We know from the Time magazine article that Ukrainian generals increasingly now are not obeying some of Ukrainian President Zelensky's orders, which they consider irrational. It's there in the Time magazine article. So this isn't entirely new. But as I said, it seems to me that these are more than just pebbles rolling down a hill. We're starting to see more rocks starting to shift. If things really start to turn bad, if the Russians break through towards the Dnieper sometime over the course of the next few months, if the Russians launch a big offensive in the spring and summer, and by the way, in that article, Stephen Bryan pointed out that the Russians have played it very cautious, very slow. They didn't launch a premature offensive of the kind many, including myself, expected last winter. They've been careful to train their troops up, build up their reserves, develop their forces and their command structures, doing the diametric opposite of what the Ukrainians have been increasingly obliged to do. Anyway, if we get these big Russian push next year, then of course it could be that this slippage of desertions and refusals to obey orders will turn into an avalanche. And all of that without my even discussing the festering political crisis in Kiev, the collapse in relations between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, which of course remains unresolved. A regime change operation in Ukraine that has turned out catastrophically, and it is obvious to me that it wasn't just Biden and Johnson who were involved. Scholz and Macron were there in all of the meetings, and the NATO bureaucracy, led by Jens Stoltenberg, was fully involved also. Well, that is where I'm going to end this discussion about the conflict in Ukraine today. Can I say, first of all, that I learnt about this article by Stephen Bryan from looking at Asia Times. He's somebody I regularly follow, but the German piece, the one by von der Schulenburg, the summary of the report by von der Schulenburg, Kuyat and Funke, I have found out about from the Mood of Alabama. So, just to say. Now, let's turn now to that other conflict, the one in the Middle East. And today, I'm going to cover this conflict more shortly. But briefly, first of all, about the hospital siege in Gaza. The Al-Shifa hospital remains under siege. There's been no attempt so far that I'm aware of by the Israeli military to storm this hospital, and it seems that fighting around the hospital continues. Let me reiterate again that the optics of this continue to be disastrous for Israel. Now, I have received an email, a very interesting, learned and careful email from a long-standing acquaintance who's pointed out that attacks on hospitals can sometimes be justified under international war crimes law, and that is true. But always one has to understand that international war crimes law is governed by the principle of proportionality. You're going to attack a hospital, then you have to show conclusively, you have to provide evidence that it is indeed the military headquarters or military base threatening your soldiers and interfering with the conduct of operations that you say it is. And of course, Israel hasn't done that. They've asserted it, but they have not gone through what one would expect in fact, what would be the required processes in order to do that. They could have demanded, for example, that the Red Cross and the UN send inspectors into the hospital, conduct an investigation of what was happening at the hospital. They could have insisted that the various agencies involved not only carry out those inspections, but that the international community support those inspections, either through the aegis of the UN Secretariat, which has wide authority in this area, or conceivably even through the Security Council. That would certainly have been achievable. They could have waited for the outcome of those inspections and investigations. If the inspectors had found that there was indeed evidence that the hospital was being used as some kind of military facility, and evidence of that kind can also be negative evidence. If, for example, those inspectors had been barred access to parts of the hospital, to the basement areas, to places that Israeli intelligence could have identified as potential access points for the bunker complex, then that is evidence of a negative kind. And given that we're not talking about a war crimes trial, it would have been evidence that many would have found convincing. Anyway, the Israelis failed to do that. They simply, as I said, asserted that this hospital was being used in that way. And moreover, and in addition, before launching their attacks, even if the existence of this military bunker complex beneath the hospital had been established, before launching the attack on the hospital, the Israelis logically, legally, should have taken further measures still, rather than launch an attack on a hospital where there are not only doctors, but also patients. And that would have included demands for Hamas fighters and operatives to evacuate the grounds of the hospital and any bunker complex existing beneath it, for inspectors and people like that to go and ensure that that evacuation did indeed take place, and for all of that to be mediated and negotiated by the international agencies. Now, things like that have been done. They were done to some extent, at least, to a great extent, through mediation with UN agencies and also with discussions between the Russian and Turkish governments. For example, during many of the sieges that have taken place in Syria. And then, if all of that had failed, Israel could have launched its attack. But even then, an attack on a hospital, even one which it was established was being used as a human shield, would need to have been conducted in a proportionate way, with the support of the international community, and perhaps with referrals to the International Criminal Court of Hamas and its operatives, given that using a hospital as a human shield is unequivocally a war crime. Now, the Israelis did none of those things, and they're now paying the political price, even as the humanitarian price is being paid by the people in the hospital and around it. As I've said before, if the Israelis do eventually storm the hospital, as I presume they will, and if they cannot produce evidence that there is indeed a great bunker complex located beneath the hospital, then the political and, by the way, the legal implications of that could be very serious indeed. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, in the meantime, I get the increasing impression that other parts, the other war, the war that's taking place in the Middle East, alongside the war in Gaza, is starting to slip out of control. Now, there were reports yesterday, I believe they are ultimately sourced from the Israeli media, but I've not had the time to find the originals. Anyway, there were reports yesterday that spoke about serious splits within the Israeli cabinet between Prime Minister Netanyahu and some of his more hardline ministers, with those ministers demanding an all-out attack on Hezbollah, and Prime Minister Netanyahu himself resisting. In a recent program that we did on the Duran, we were privileged to do on the Duran, with Professor John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer pointed out that given the steady shift in opinion in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu might very soon come to be seen almost as a moderate voice, given that the hardliners who he has to a great extent himself empowered are getting stronger all the time. And we can already see, perhaps, in these rumours of cabinet splits, signs of that. And all of this is connected to the deteriorating military picture on Israel's northern border between Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, gave another speech on Saturday. Now, in terms of its actual substantive content, it differed little from the previous speech that he gave a week earlier. He did not commit Hezbollah to an all-out war, and I still get the strong impression that for the moment at least, neither he nor the Hezbollah leadership nor the Iranian government want to see an all-out war between themselves and Israel in the Middle East, and between themselves and the United States. Iran's priority, and this will have been communicated to Hezbollah, is to seek diplomatic outcomes. And following the meeting in Riyadh, which I discussed extensively in my program yesterday, it seems to me that the Iranians have good reason to think that those diplomatic outcomes are moving in their direction. But it is perhaps difficult for Hezbollah, for Nasrallah and the Iranian government to keep full control of the situation. We already see that there are rumours that Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming under increasing pressure to open a new front by Israel against Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah himself almost certainly is coming under growing pressure from people within his own movement, disciplined though it is, asking why Hezbollah is standing aside and is not supporting their Arab brothers in Gaza by engaging Israel more forcefully in a conflict there. And I understand that there's also complaints in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon about Hezbollah's passivity, relative passivity, in light of the ongoing conflict in Gaza. So Nasrallah who has to retain control of his organisation and keep it disciplined. He's trying to balance his measured and restrained actions by toughening his rhetoric. And even though the substance of his speech on Saturday differed little, or so it seemed to me, from the one he made a week before, nonetheless, the rhetoric, the actual rhetoric he used was much stronger and far more impassioned. And all of this is happening alongside clear signs that the fighting now between Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces looks like it is actually intensifying. So we have that situation, very tense situation, on the border. But we're getting more and more reports now of intensifying fighting between US forces and Shia militias, Shia and Muslim militias, both in Iraq and in Syria. There have been more US air and missile strikes, and the US is now openly talking about the fact that it is striking at bases of Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps. So in effect, the United States is taking military action against a branch of Iran's armed forces. And there are now reports of increasing counterstrikes by militia forces backed by Iran against American bases in Syria and Iraq also. And I get the impression that with every day, the intensity of these exchanges is growing. Now, we are not yet in a situation of all-out war, and conceivably and possibly we can avoid it. But it remains the case that even as the Muslim states have come together in that meeting in Riyadh and are probably preparing further moves in the United Nations in cooperation with the Chinese chairmanship of the Security Council. Even as all of that is happening, the situation in the Middle East is deteriorating, and the United States doesn't seem to be doing very much, diplomatically speaking, to contain it. All that they're doing is issuing further threats of ever greater military action, launching more missile attacks on first militia and now Iranian Revolutionary Guards targets. There seems to be no attempt to enter into some kind of dialogue with the Iranians and potentially with Hezbollah also, in order to bring this whole situation under control. And I can't help but think that partly the reason for that is because the administration worries that if it started discussions of that nature, that might be politically damaging for the administration itself, domestically in the United States, but also more particularly because it worries that if it were involved in those kind of discussions with the Iranians and with Hezbollah, then the Iranians and Hezbollah might start to make political demands, like demands for ceasefires in Gaza and for Security Council resolutions, which the administration doesn't want to countenance. Now, that might be understandable, but in the meantime, it is creating a very dangerous diplomatic vacuum in which this whole situation looks to me as if it threatens to spiral out of control. Well, that's one thing There is another thing that is apparently looming over the horizon, and which might just conceivably help in some ways to bring the diplomatic process back on track, which is that it's now confirmed that President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping are going to meet in San Francisco on Wednesday. And I can't help but think that amongst the many topics that they will discuss, President Xi Jinping, whose country now chairs the UN Security Council, will be bringing with him ideas based on what was discussed by the Muslim states in Riyadh to take this diplomatic process forward and to try to stabilize the situation in the Middle East. Whether President Biden is going to be interested in all of that, I don't know. That is going to be a very difficult and fraught meeting. There's been reports in the British media, including the BBC, by the way, that the United States is now working towards a $10 billion arms package to build up Taiwan's army. I am sure that the Chinese government is aware of those reports. It seems incredible to me that the US government hasn't understood that far from deterring China, these types of military build-ups in Taiwan are far more likely to provoke China, just as US military support for Ukraine did not deter action by Russia in Ukraine. Instead, it provoked it. But anyway, the Chinese undoubtedly are aware of all of this, and that is going to make for a very difficult meeting on Wednesday indeed, between two men who don't like or trust each other, as each in their very different ways has made clear. But if you want to look for negotiation, for diplomacy, in order to try to bring this whole situation in the Middle East under some sort of control, this meeting between Xi and Biden on Wednesday looks to be the only game in town. I have to say, I don't take any comfort from that at all. I don't honestly believe that this is going to lead to anything much. And in the meantime, the situation in Gaza, in the broader Middle East, continues to spiral out of control, even as the crisis the West finds itself in Ukraine also deepens. Well, there we are. That's my programme for today. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, let me remind you once more, if you want to, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.